a grandstand, a racetrack, a dark stretch of two-lane highway. None of these places look dangerous. They look like nothing at all. The kind of ordinary ground a person crosses 100 times without thinking. But on 5 different days, spread across the 20th century and into the 21st, that ordinary ground opened up and swallowed people whole. A speedway in Florida, a road circuit in the Netherlands, an interstate in Kentucky, a packed spectator enclosure in the west of France, a highway in the Mississippi Delta. Some of what happened on those roads was watched live by crowds and by millions more at home, who had no idea in the moment what they were actually seeing unfold in front of them. A few of these crashes did more than end a life. They rewrote the rules of an entire sport, forced governments to act, and changed the machines the rest of us drive. Here are 5 of the most disturbing car crash deaths ever recorded. It is February 18, 2001, at Daytona International Speedway in Daytona Beach, Florida, and the Daytona 500 is down to its final lap. Dale Earnhardt Sr. sits in 3rd place, and the 2 cars ahead of him belong to people he cares about more than the trophy in front of them. His son, Dale Earnhardt Jr., and his teammate, Michael Waltrip. Earnhardt isn't racing for the win anymore. He's racing to guard it, holding his line behind his own drivers, using his black No. 3 Chevrolet to keep faster cars from slipping through and stealing the moment from his team. Coming through turn 4, Earnhardt makes contact with Sterling Marlin's car first, a glancing touch that sends his own car sliding. He tries to correct it, and as he does, the car drifts up the track directly into the path of Ken Schroeder. Schroeder hits him on the driver's side. Earnhardt's car snaps toward the outside wall and goes in nearly head-on. Here's what makes this crash different from almost every other fatal wreck in racing history. It doesn't look like much. There's no fireball. There's no car tumbling end over end through the air. The car hits the wall. Both vehicles slide down into the infield grass, and they stop. On television, it barely registers as more dangerous than a dozen other wrecks fans had already watched that same afternoon. Schroeder climbs out of his own car almost immediately, uninjured, and walks over to check on Earnhardt. He looks inside the window. Something in his face changes. Earnhardt died of a basilar skull fracture, an injury caused not by the visible violence of a crash, but by the sudden extreme deceleration of the head snapping forward while the torso stays belted in place. The bones, where the skull meets the spine, simply gave way. Investigators later estimated the car struck the wall at roughly 157 to 161 miles per hour, at an angle that concentrated the force in the worst possible way, subjecting his body to deceleration measured in dozens of times the force of gravity. It killed him instantly. There was no slow decline, no fight in an ambulance. The moment his car struck that wall, it was already over. 17 professional drivers had already died from basilar skull fractures in the years leading up to that afternoon, many of them in wrecks that, like Earnhardt's, looked survivable to anyone watching. The killer was never the fire or the tumbling wreck people picture when they imagine a fatal crash. It was the invisible physics of a head continuing to travel forward after the car had already stopped. But nobody watching knew that yet. As Earnhardt's car sat still in the grass, the race kept going. Up front, Michael Waltrip crossed the finish line first, and Dale Earnhardt Jr. crossed just behind him in second. In victory lane, son and teammate were celebrating, hugging, soaked in the emotion of the moment, while 2 miles away, at Halifax Medical Center, doctors were confirming that Dale Earnhardt Sr. was gone. The team didn't grasp what had happened until well after the celebration had already begun. The irony sat heavy over everything that followed. Earnhardt had chased a Daytona 500 win for almost 20 years, coming up short again and again in a race that seemed to have it out for him, before he finally won it in 1998. 3 years later, he returned to that same track and died on the final lap, not chasing his own victory but guarding someone else's. The aftermath reshaped the sport. NASCAR launched a lengthy investigation into the crash, one that dragged the organization through months of public scrutiny over how it had handled driver safety, including a bitter dispute over the failure of Earnhardt's seatbelt and questions about why the sport had been so slow to act on a known killer. Within the year, The hands device, a head and neck restraint built to stop exactly the kind of whip that killed Earnhardt, became mandatory across the sport's top series. The engineer who helped develop it later estimated that Earnhardt would very likely have survived had he been wearing one. Energy-absorbing soft walls, known as safer barriers, were installed at tracks across the country, replacing the bare concrete that had killed him. Black boxes to record crash data, mandatory head and neck restraints, and tougher inspection of belts and seats all followed. Earnhardt had resisted wearing a hands device himself, reportedly calling it uncomfortable and restrictive, telling one driver who wore it that he looked like he needed it more than he did. The reforms that came after his death were, in the coldest possible sense, his final contribution to the sport he had dominated. No driver has died in NASCAR's Top Cup Series in a race since. It is July 29, 1973, at Circuit Zandvoort in the Netherlands, and the Dutch Grand Prix is only 8 laps old. Roger Williamson, 25 years old, is driving in just his second Formula One race, a young British talent behind the wheel of a March 731, backed by his mentor Tom Wheatcroft. He's still new to this level of racing, still building the reputation that had already made him a 2-time champion in the junior ranks back home. At the high-speed S's near the Tunnel Oost, something goes wrong. Most accounts point to a tire failure, though a few have suggested a suspension breakage instead, and the exact cause was never settled with certainty. Whatever triggers it, Williamson's car snaps sideways at speed and flips, landing upside down on its roll hoop. Almost immediately, it catches fire. The car sits there, inverted, flames climbing around the cockpit, and Williamson is alive inside it. He isn't badly hurt from the impact itself. He's trapped beneath the overturned wreck, conscious, and the fire is spreading around him. Another driver sees it happen. David Purley, a fellow Briton and a friend of Williamson's, pulls his own car off the track and abandons his race without a second's hesitation. He runs across the still active circuit toward the burning car while the rest of the field keeps going. Purley tries to flip it upright by himself, working against a machine that weighs hundreds of pounds. He can hear Williamson underneath it, calling out to him. This is the part of the story people remember for the wrong reasons. The marshals nearby aren't equipped for a fire like this. They're wearing ordinary blazers, not the fire-resistant suits the drivers wear, and the only extinguisher on hand is small, next to useless against flames already climbing over the bodywork. Purley grabs it anyway and tries to fight the fire alone. It barely slows it down. Meanwhile, the race continues. Drivers pass the burning wreck lap after lap, because most of them believe Purley crashed and that the car sitting there is empty. Purley stands in the middle of the circuit, waving his arms, trying to get anyone, to stop and help him lift the car. Nobody does. He's alone out there, fighting a fire that's already winning for a friend he can hear but can't reach. By the time a proper fire truck finally arrives and the flames are put out, it's too late. Roger Williamson has died of smoke inhalation and burns, not from the crash itself, but from everything that happened, or failed to happen, in the minutes after it. For his effort, David Purley was awarded the George Medal, one of the highest civilian honors for bravery in the United Kingdom, recognition for a rescue attempt that never had a real chance of working. Not because Purley lacked courage, but because everyone around him lacked the tools and the training to act. The photographers who captured the scene, Purley alone at the burning car, arms raised, begging the passing cars to stop, produced a sequence so wrenching it won that year's World Press Photo Award for photo sequences. And the entire ordeal, the flip, the fire, Purley's solitary attempt, the cars racing past, was caught on live television, watched in real time by an audience that had no idea they were witnessing a death nobody could stop. The failures that killed Williamson were so basic that they finally forced the sport to confront how little stood between a driver and a fire. In the years that followed, fire-resistant clothing became mandatory for the trackside marshals, so that the next time a car went over and burned, the people standing closest would actually be able to reach in and pull someone out. Better extinguishers, faster medical intervention, and proper rescue training followed across Formula One. It is a grim pattern that repeats through the history of motorsport safety. Almost nothing changes until someone dies in a way that makes the gaps impossible to ignore. and Roger Williamson became one of those someones. What stays with people about Zandvoort in 1973 isn't the crash itself. Cars flip and catch fire in racing, and sometimes drivers walk away from exactly that. What stays with people is the 7 or 8 minutes after, the gap between Williamson still being alive and Williamson being gone, filled entirely by one man's hands and a fire extinguisher built for a kitchen, not a Formula One car. It is May 14, 1988, on Interstate 71 near Carrollton, Kentucky, and a church youth group bus is heading home. The passengers belong to a group from Radcliffe, Kentucky, tied to the First Assembly of God, and they've spent the day at Kings Island, an amusement park near Cincinnati. The bus is loud in the way these trips always are. Kids trading seats, chaperones counting heads, everyone tired in the good way that comes from a day of rides and heat and too much sugar. They're heading south, back toward home, back toward a Sunday morning. Coming the other way, on the same stretch of highway, is a pickup truck going the wrong direction entirely. It's traveling north in the southbound lanes. Behind the wheel is Larry Mahoney, 34 years old, and his blood alcohol content is measured at 0.24%, well over twice Kentucky's legal limit at the time. He's been driving against the flow of traffic for some distance before anyone in his path has a chance to react. There's no warning that registers in time. The truck and the bus, a 1977 Ford chassis carrying a converted school bus body, meet head-on. The impact itself doesn't kill most of the people on that bus. What kills them is what happens in the seconds after. The front of the bus is shoved backward, and the collision drives the right front of the chassis through the stepwell just inside the door, tearing open the gasoline tank mounted there. Fuel ignites almost instantly, faster than anyone inside can process. One moment, there's the shock of the crash, the sound of it, the confusion. The next moment, there's heat and thick black smoke filling a space that was built to carry kids to an amusement park, not to help them escape a fire. Every single person who died that night died from the fire and smoke, not from the crash itself. That's the second failure, stacked on top of the first. The bus's emergency exits were never built for a crisis like this one. The rear door, the only real way out for most of the passengers, was difficult to reach and slow to use even on a calm afternoon. Under fire, in the dark, with panic spreading through the aisle, it turned into something closer to a bottleneck than an exit. Kids who might have made it out through a building with proper doors and proper spacing were instead fighting through smoke toward one narrow opening, while the adults around them tried to push them through it, and, in some cases, simply couldn't. 27 people died that night. 24 of them were children and teenagers, kids who woke up that morning thinking about roller coasters, not about their last hours. 3 adults died alongside them. 34 more survived with injuries, some of them severe, some of them carrying scars for the rest of their lives. It remains, to this day, the deadliest drunk driving crash in American history, a record nobody wanted, and nobody has taken from it since. Larry Mahoney survived the crash he caused. He was tried and convicted on 27 counts of manslaughter and sentenced to 16 years in prison, a sentence that could never balance against what was lost on that highway, but stood as the only form of accountability the law had to offer. He served roughly 9.5 years before his release in 1999, and largely disappeared from public life afterward. What the disaster did leave behind was change, driven in part by the parents of the children who died, who turned their grief into a long campaign against drunk driving and for safer buses. Federal investigators pored over the wreck, and design standards for school buses were rewritten in the years that followed. Fuel tanks had to be enclosed in protective cages and placed to survive exactly the kind of intrusion that turned this collision into a fire. Interiors had to use flame-retardant materials that would not feed the smoke so quickly. Emergency exit requirements were tightened, so buses built afterward would give passengers far more than a single narrow rear door and push-out windows to escape through in the dark. None of it undid what happened on Interstate 71 that night. It just meant the next bus full of kids coming home from a theme park would have a real chance of making it out, if the worst ever found them too. It is June 11th, 1955, at the Circuit de la Sarthe near Le Mans, France, and the 24 Hours of Le Mans has been running for a little over 2 hours. The grandstands opposite the pits are packed. Tens of thousands of people pressed together behind a low earthen bank and a fence, close enough to feel the cars go by. This is the greatest endurance race in the world, and out front the two fastest teams on the planet, Mercedes and Jaguar, are trading the lead lap after lap. Behind the wheel of the number 20 Mercedes-Benz 300 SLR is Pierre Leve, a 49-year-old Frenchman driving the race of his life in front of his home crowd. What happens next unfolds in less than 2 seconds. Approaching the pits, Jaguar's Mike Hawthorne is signaled to come in, and he brakes hard and cuts to the right toward the pit lane. Directly behind him, Lance Macklin, in a slower Austin Healey, has to swerve left to avoid running into the back of the braking Jaguar. And directly behind Macklin, closing at well over 120 miles per hour, is Leve with nowhere to go. His Mercedes clips the back of the Austin Healey and is launched into the air. The car sails over the earthen bank that was supposed to protect the crowd. It comes apart as it goes, and the pieces do not slow down. The engine, the front axle, the hood, tear loose and scythe through the packed enclosure like shrapnel. Leve is thrown from the wreck and killed instantly, but the spectators, standing shoulder to shoulder with nowhere to run, take the full force of the flying debris. Then the fire starts, and the fire is where the death toll turns into something almost impossible to comprehend. The Mercedes was built with a body made from a magnesium alloy, chosen because it was light and fast. Magnesium burns. When the fuel ignited, the heat set the bodywork itself alight, and it burned white hot. Rescue workers, not understanding what they were dealing with, poured water onto the burning magnesium, which only made it flare hotter and scatter further. The wreck burned in the middle of the crowd for hours. More than 80 people died. The most commonly cited figure is 83 spectators plus Levegh himself, with well over 100 more injured, many of them horrifically. It remains, to this day, the deadliest accident in the history of motorsport, and nothing else has ever come close. And then, almost unbelievably, the race went on. The organizers made a cold calculation. If they stopped the race, the tens of thousands of spectators would flood out onto the same narrow roads the ambulances needed to reach the hospitals. So, they kept it running through the night. The surviving cars circling past the scene of the disaster hour after hour, while emergency crews worked in the enclosure. Mercedes, once its directors in Germany understood the scale of what had happened, quietly withdrew its remaining cars in the early hours of the morning. The company would pull out of motor racing entirely and stay away for more than 3 decades. The official inquiry assigned no criminal blame to any single driver, calling it a terrible racing accident, and instead pointed at a circuit whose safety had not kept pace with how fast the cars had become. The reaction elsewhere was immediate and severe. Several countries banned motor racing outright in the aftermath. Switzerland's ban on circuit racing was the most extraordinary of all, lasting more than 60 years, only fully unwound in the 2020s. At Le Mans, the pit straight was torn up and rebuilt, widened to give the cars and the crowd room that had never existed before. What makes the disaster so hard to sit with is how ordinary its cause was. Not a mechanical failure, not recklessness, just 3 fast cars arriving at the same narrow piece of road at the same instant, in front of people who had simply come to watch. It is the early morning of September 26, 1937, on U.S. Route 61 in the Mississippi Delta, somewhere in the stretch of highway near Clarksdale, Mississippi. Some accounts place the exact spot closer to a community called Mixon, but the general area isn't in dispute. What matters is the darkness, the road, and the 2 people riding through it. Bessie Smith is approximately 43 years old, and by 1937 she's known across the country as the Empress of the Blues, a voice that shaped an entire era of American music. She's in the middle of a comeback tour through the South, riding in a car driven by her companion, Richard Morgan. The highway ahead is unlit, the kind of rural dark that swallows headlights whole. Somewhere in that darkness sits a parked truck, stopped in the road with nothing marking it. No flare, no warning. Morgan doesn't see it in time. The car strikes the truck's rear end at speed. The impact is catastrophic for Smith. Her right arm is nearly torn from her body, and she's bleeding heavily, the kind of injury that doesn't leave the room for a slow response. A physician happens to be driving that same stretch of highway a short while later. Dr. Hugh Smith, no relation to Bessie, stops and does what he can at the scene, working in the dark on a woman he doesn't know, trying to keep her alive long enough to reach help. For decades afterward, a story attached itself to this night, one repeated in magazines, in biographies, even in a stage play. The story claimed Bessie Smith was turned away from a whites-only hospital because of her race and bled to death waiting for care that never came. It's a story that fits everything true about Mississippi in 1937, which is exactly why it spread so easily and lasted so long. But biographer Chris Albertson, in his book Bessie, examined the account in detail and found no evidence to support it. Smith was taken directly to the G.T. Thomas Afro-American Hospital in Clarksdale. There was no refusal, no white hospital turning her away at the door. She died there from injuries that had already become unsurvivable before she ever reached it. Part of how the myth took hold traces back to a piece the writer and producer John Hammond published in a music magazine within weeks of her death, repeating the rumor of a white hospital's refusal. It fit the era, and it spread far faster than any correction ever could. Decades later, the playwright Edward Albee built a one-act play, The Death of Bessie Smith, around that same version of events, cementing it in the public imagination further. Albertson's careful reconstruction, drawn from the people actually at the scene, including the doctor who stopped to help, dismantled it piece by piece. The legend persisted anyway, because it carried something true, even where the specific claim didn't hold up. Segregation was real in that place, and that year, and it had already shaped which hospital she was taken to in the first place. A black hospital, not the nearest one, in a state where that distinction was never incidental. What killed Bessie Smith wasn't a hospital's door. It was a dark highway. A truck stopped with no warning, and injuries a body simply couldn't hold on long enough to survive. 5 roads, spread across most of a century, a speedway, a Grand Prix circuit, a church bus on a Kentucky interstate, a packed grandstand at Le Mans, a highway in the Delta. Some of these crashes claimed one life, and some claimed dozens, but every one of them shared the same shape. The ordinary motion of a car came apart in seconds, in front of people who had no reason to believe that day was any different from the one before it. And nothing on the other side of that moment ever looked the same again.